I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London, but discussing the United States of America. If there's ever been an election that better justified my old epithet as being fought between two cheeks of the same backside, it must be the contest between President Donald Trump and Sleepy Joe Biden. The former rampaging, often appearing to be inches from madness, and now acting as Lazarus, having walked out of the Walter Reed Hospital, apparently ready to do so within hours, but actually doing so within 3 days, and pretending that he's all right. Although his Twitter feed would suggest that either the coronavirus or the medicine that he took to cure it in such a miraculous way has sent him over the edge. On one night, he tweeted 35 tweets, all in capital letters, all indecipherable dog whistles, one presumes, to his voting base, which is about 40% of the United States electorate. Joe Biden, the Democratic Party challenger, may not be inches from madness, but is certainly well into his dotage. Sleepy Joe, they call him. Some people call him Creepy Joe, and if you've seen the YouTube videos, you'll get an idea why. Joe Biden oftentimes seems to have difficulty remembering his own name, his own status, and the office for which he is running. Last week, on television, I urge you to check out the video. He claimed to have been in the US Senate for 180 years, which means he was elected long before the American Civil War, which means he might have given the Gettysburg Address. He may imagine that he gave the Gettysburg Address. But despite these limitations, the Democratic Party challenger on all the opinion polls is ahead by enough to win a landslide victory. Not just in the national poll, but in the swing states that Donald Trump won last time, because the Democrats put up the only candidate in America that could possibly have lost to Donald Trump, by the name of Hillary Clinton. If Joe Biden wins those swing states this time, then it will be a humiliating defeat for Donald Trump. But there are a couple of caveats that need to be made to that. The first, as one of my guests knows well, is the phenomenon we used to call here in Britain the shy conservative voter. Now, if a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed liberal Ivy League graduate came up to you with a clipboard asking if you were going to vote for Donald Trump, would you admit it? There was that phenomenon back in the 80s in Britain, where far fewer people would admit to voting for Margaret Thatcher than actually did. The second caveat is more important and potentially more deadly. The Republican voters will almost all be voting in person on the day. That means that the exit polls and the clamor on the election day itself will all be for Donald Trump, because the great majority of Democratic Party voters are going to vote by post. And those votes will not be counted for days, maybe weeks after the event, during which period Donald Trump will be claiming victory and claiming that he's more than ready for a second term in office. And when that balance begins to shift as postal vote results are announced, the scene could be set for a violent reaction perhaps even coordinated by Donald Trump, perhaps even encouraged by Donald Trump, which could lead to serious disruptions to social peace in the United States of America, a country where there hasn't been much social peace for quite a considerable time. Why do I call them two cheeks of the same backside? Well, for people watching this across the Arab world, trust me, there ain't no difference between the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of the biggest geopolitical issues that affect most of the people that will be watching this show. These are my views, of course. I'm joined by a distinguished audience, couldn't get much more distinguished. So let's hear their perspective on these events. Stephen Norris, longtime Member of Parliament, Minister in the Conservative government, a man who knows the Arab Middle East very well indeed. Did I say anything wrong there?
No, I don't think you did, George. I actually do think that it is incredible that out of a country of 360 million people, the two candidates are a 74-year-old former multimillionaire who has been so unsuccessful in business despite his protestations that actually he paid no tax. He didn't actually want to conceal his tax return because it would show how rich he was. He never wanted to conceal his tax return or release his tax return because he knew it would show how poor a businessman he actually was. This is from a guy who wrote a book who's paid for a book to be written in his name called The Art of the Deal. And on the other hand, as you say...
A man who was left by his father several $100 million.
Indeed, and who, if that had been taken away and put in a nice hedge fund, he'd now have $4 billion. As it is, he's virtually squandered the lot, and where he's borrowed the money to keep his business going, of course, is another story. But on the other hand, Joe Biden, is that really the best that, if you like, the centre and left of American politics can produce? A 77-year-old who, as you say, is clearly not in the best of mental health, God bless him.
Cognitively challenged.
Cognitively challenged would be an entirely appropriate description. And I think you're also right that bluntly, whoever does emerge as president after all of very, very dangerous events have transpired, which you accurately outlined, the difference between the voting in person and the postal votes and the implications of that. I think in terms of attitudes to the Middle East, frankly, it's two sides of the same coin. I thought I'd be slightly more polite in my analogy, but you're bang on the money.
Jonathan Fryer, distinguished writer, broadcaster, Liberal Democrat, presumably leaning politically more towards Joe Biden, or at least to his party. Did you recognize the picture I painted?
To a degree, but not entirely, as you would expect, George. And it's interesting, of course, that according to a recent opinion poll, all the parties in this country, apart from the Brexit party, are hoping for Joe Biden to win, even though he has certain shortcomings. I wouldn't agree that they're two sides of, or two cheeks of the same backside, though. I think Donald Trump is unbelievably awful to a degree that Joe Biden isn't. I don't think Joe Biden is an awful man. I don't think he's an immoral man. I don't think he is a liar, all of which are apt to describe Donald Trump. Certainly Joe Biden's performance in some of the not only in the one debate that's happened so far, TV debate, and also in interviews, has not been performing magnificently. And it is astonishing, as Steve said, that out of the American public, they couldn't find anyone better than that. But I suppose some of us will be hoping that if he does win, and we hope he will win, that maybe at some stage he will stand aside and Kamala Harris will take over. I think is a much more impressive...
We know nothing, though.
But she's a much more impressive.
She's
a much more impressive figure, and also, of course, we have to remember, although it's often said the US president is the most powerful man in the world, it's not actually true. There are limits on the power of the US president, and what's really important is who are the team behind him. On the issue of the Middle East, though, I also would disagree on that, because I do think that Joe Biden is less bad than Donald Trump. We can certainly be assured that he will back Israel. He's already made that very clear in the Israel-Palestine dispute. However, there is considerable hope in the European capitals, London, Paris, Berlin, that he could be much more positive on the Iran nuclear deal. As we know, Donald Trump has put an atom bomb underneath the deal, but if Joe Biden wins, I think he will very likely consider this much more favourably, and that would be a really good thing, obviously for Iran, but for Middle East peace as well.
Ahmed Caballo, up-and-coming prize journalist, broadcaster, and welcome guest on the show. Isn't it really a question of manners, that Donald Trump has no manners, that he's as vulgar, a kind of archetypal Texan? He's not a Texan, but he might as well have a cowboy hat and big boots on, brash, ignorant, ignorant in every respect, including literally. Isn't it really the case that that's the only difference between the two men? Because although Jonathan says that Joe Biden paints him as a kind of respectable figure, in fact, in terms of allegations of corruption, allegations of personal bad behavior towards women and girls and so on, his record is actually as checkered as Donald Trump's. He's just not so upfront and obviously offensive and noxious.
Of course, and that's what worries the US establishment. Donald Trump is the face of US empire with its mask pulled off, and they want to conceal that mask. They don't want us to see the nature of the beast. Now, to compare what Trump would do and what Biden would do for the Middle East, we have to look at what Trump's done in his first 4 years and what the Obama administration did in its first 4 years. Let's not forget, 2011, they waged away the war on Libya, the most prosperous African country at the time, that's been decimated, and the legacy of that decimation we can still see today. They also supported a covert war in Syria, supporting the most militant Takfiri terrorists in order to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Yes, yes, Trump has ripped up the Iran nuclear deal. Yes, he's tried to enforce this so-called deal of the century, which is basically ripped up the so-called two-state solution. Yes, he's ramped up sanctions in Syria, in Venezuela. So they have their positives and their negatives. Biden surely would go back to the negotiation table in terms of the JCPOA. He appears to not take as aggressive approach when it comes to sanctions, which do kill just as many people in some ways as the bombs that get dropped from the sky. But I think the real issue isn't so much what Donald Trump says, but it's more what he represents. The reason why there's people that walk around the states in the United States with artillery weapons and assault rifles is because they think that Donald Trump represents them and they think they're defending their president. And it's not so much what Donald Trump's policies that worry me, it's more what he represents. I've been going to far-right marches here in the UK, and there's definitely an emboldened nature about these kind of activists, if you want to call them that, because they think the so-called most powerful man in the world is somewhat politically aligned to their worldview. So if there was going to be any positive at all to Joe Biden becoming the president, hopefully it can fracture that relationship between the people on the streets and the politicians and the far-right ideology that we're seeing on the comeback.
Let's hear from Professor Inderjeet Parmar. It only seems like yesterday that you and I were talking at the time of Donald Trump's victory. Professor Parmar is the Professor of International Politics at the City University of London and visiting Professor at the London School of Economics. Welcome, Professor, to the discussion.
It's a pleasure.
Trump's impact, coronavirus, COVID-19, these are extraordinary events by anybody's standards. Does that make this election more significant than others that you have covered?
No, I think on balance, I think this is a it's an exceptional election. And I think for the first time, probably since the 1860 election, where 11 southern states refused to accept the result and broke away from the Union, I think they both have refused to confirm that they would accept the election result if they were to be defeated on November the 3rd. And they have not signed up or confirmed that they would actually be committed to a peaceful transfer of power. So in that regard, I think the stakes in the election are very, very high. And President Trump has on numerous occasions said that any result in which he is defeated must be fraudulent. And that has got to be down to the mail-in ballots, which he argues are rife with fraud. And he's urged his supporters to go in person to vote on November the 3rd. And he is fully aware that the majority of Democratic voters have said that they're going to vote by mail-in ballots. So he's basically trying to suggest that any result in which he loses is a fraudulent result, is a rigged election, a stolen election. And on that basis, it suggests there's going to be a very chaotic kind of a few weeks, if not longer, after November the 3rd. So it makes it a standout election in those respects.
Professor, what has changed over the last 4 years?
President Trump has said he's called on people to come out and be poll watchers. There's a website, Army for Trump, of poll watchers and so on, which is recruiting thousands of people. He's praised the person in Wisconsin, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who shot and killed 2 people and wounded others, as restoring law and order and so on. So I think there's going to be a very volatile situation in which I think there will be the presence of armed groups and people. And we must remember also that police forces and sheriff's departments around the country have often welcomed these armed men and women to support the police against peaceful protesters and so on. So I fully expect that there will be the presence of armed militias and so on that day. And I think the other thing, of course, is that back in the late 70s, early 80s, the courts banned such private Republican Party initiatives to recruit such poll watchers because they had been intimidating voters in those elections. And that order by the court expired in 2018. And since that's expired, the Trump administration and the other Republicans have basically openly been asking for more and more of that kind of poll watching support. So yes, I think it's a very volatile situation.
There were 29 candidates running for the Democratic nomination, and the best they could come up with was Joe Biden. How on earth did that happen?
Well, the Democratic Party is basically a center-right political party. It has shown in 2016 and also in the 2020 primaries that it basically hasn't changed from what it was and historically has been really in the last 40 years, 30 or at least 30 years. So it's a right-wing party. It organized a big campaign to defeat the left, particularly Bernie Sanders, and Biden emerged as the least divisive other candidate. And quite frankly, he represents the kind of traditional corporate politics of the Democratic Party, which has dominated it as well. And the idea of him probably being there for 2 terms, 8 years, it's pretty unlikely.
Stephen Norris, as the professor described what might happen, it sounded like, you and I used to be election observers in countries that were less developed democratically than one imagines the United States to be. To some extent, he was describing a banana republic there. Yeah. It's easy to dismiss that as scaremongering, but given the events of this year in the United States already, on the Black Lives Matter and police killings and so on, it's not really fanciful, is it?
No, I don't think it is fanciful. I think it's probably the most significant danger facing this election because there is actually no evidence that the mail-in ballots will have been tampered with. There's a lot of evidence, incidentally, that the US Postal Service is in a pretty sorry state nationally, but certainly not corrupted in the way that Trump will allege. But a far greater danger, nor incidentally, can I just say, is there, I think, any danger that if the postal vote outweighs the vote in person and it's clear that that Biden has won, will there be any issue around who's going to take the oath in January? Because frankly, as you know, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate has made it absolutely clear that the vote will be respected. And I think that's because privately, a lot of Republicans are horrified by the image that Trump presents of the Republican Party, whilst they may privately quite like his approach to business and some of his, if you like,
tax cuts for the very
forthright, his tax cuts for some of the richest people in the States. Nonetheless, you know, they are sufficiently serious to want to ensure the result is observed. Here's the question, therefore, which I do think the professor was perfectly reasonably articulating. Will people actually be able to vote? Will they feel unreasonably threatened when they go to a polling station and there are people armed with, you know, with machine guns and so on, being pretty clearly on one side of the debate rather than the other? I think that's an open question. I mean, we do live, of course, in a society where that is simply inconceivable. In the States, of course, you live in a society where the right to bear arms is one of the most, treasured elements of the Constitution, particularly for those on the right. I think this is the real danger. The real danger is on the day.
Isn't it compounded by the fear, paranoia perhaps, but also a real possibility that Donald Trump, if he loses, will face criminal prosecution, that there will be a kind of, in the way that he used to chant, lock her up.
Yeah.
Maybe they will lock him up. And therefore, to some extent, he might have nothing to lose.
Oh, I don't think he has anything to lose, because you're absolutely right. I mean, apart from his private conduct, if you like, which incidentally I have to say is in a different category from allegations against Biden. Allegations against Biden are in terms of his inappropriate behavior with women, that he may have got a little bit too close on occasions. Nobody's suggesting that he's paying for hookers in the way that the President of the United States has clearly done on several occasions and then tried to shut them up with cash. No, I think that it'll be his business affairs that will catch him, and that might well see him serving time. Having said which, of course, the lawyers in the States will probably take
spin it out for longer.
They'll take a decade or so to get him there. But yes, he has nothing to lose and everything to gain from doing everything possible to suggest that the election is either fraudulent or that it's accurate, because his people will have prevented Democrat voters going to the polls, particularly voters of color, ethnic minority voters across the nation, easily identifiable, if you like, and people who may be discouraged by the threat of people with arms outside the polling booths. I think it's a serious issue.
Much more of this in the second half. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, in London, but discussing the United States. And why wouldn't we be? It's only days until the presidential election, and who is in the White House is obviously of great moment to practically everybody in the world. In fact, I can't think of anybody in the world who does not have skin in this game. The people of Iran, the people of the Arab Middle East, the people of Latin America, of China, of Russia, and so on, are all vitally interested, although from different sides. If you were Chinese, you probably want Donald Trump to lose. If you're Russian, you probably want Donald Trump to win. And if you're Iranian, you want Donald Trump to lose, and so on. But everyone has a dog in this fight. Jonathan Fryer, I suppose the doomsday option that we've been discussing may not come to pass. Let's pray that it doesn't. If it doesn't, Joe Biden wins. Isn't Nancy Pelosi's latest move of ramping up the 25th Amendment, whereby the cabinet can more easily remove the sitting president if they're not up to the job? Isn't this a way, as Donald Trump identified, of getting rid of Joe Biden quite quickly? The cabinet may decide at the first meeting that the elected president is cognitively challenged to such an extent that his deputy takes his place. And I want to press you on the Kamala Harris thing. Kamala Harris stood in the primaries, but took off or failed to take off so disastrously that she withdrew before a vote had been cast. And yet, just by appointment, she might very quickly be the President of the United States.
Well, as you know, George, politics is a very strange business. It's a lot about luck as well as talent and other achievements. And indeed, Kamala Harris now being the vice presidential candidate with possibly an eye on the top job in the end is all about luck, basically. But I do think that she's watching her perform, for example, in the vice presidential debate against Mike Pence, just so much a cooler person, more empathy, and also she can, I hope, motivate a lot of the non-white voters in America to actually go out and vote. Because I think this is a really critical point about this election. Trump will motivate the rednecks, and all of the other white conservatives will go out and vote for him, apart from some Republicans who are so disgusted with him that they said they'll back Biden. The problem will be how many of the Hispanics and African Americans will also go out and vote, because their voting record is often much lower and it needs someone to motivate them, as Barack Obama did, certainly particularly in the first election when he stood. And so that, I think, Kamala Harris will be good for that. As for Nancy Pelosi, I think it's right that they've taken out this sort of insurance policy. And although, yes, to a certain extent, it's looking forward to have something so that if Joe Biden, for some reason, does become less capable to perform the action, then it's easier to get rid of him. But I think it's also looking back to Trump and wish we had that in place and people took it seriously, because perhaps there would have been a move to get rid of him once he started showing not dementia, but a degree of madness.
Unhinged. I think some of Donald Trump's behavior is literally unbelievable. You cannot believe that the President of the United States is talking like that, is acting like that.
He put out a tweet the other night, which he subsequently was taken down, saying, "My cure for COVID was my own blood."
My own blood.
This is mad.
My own blood is the vaccine. He maybe thinks he's Jesus rather than Lazarus. Yes.
I was just going to make one thing, though. The 25th Amendment is unfortunately quite vague about what constitutes unfitness.
Yeah.
Actually, my view is Pelosi will not want Kamala Harris too quickly. They will set the bar quite high. If it's evident that Joe Biden literally is suffering from a seriously detrimental dementia, then I think the 25th Amendment would be accepted by all sides. I think the Democrats would be very happy to have Sleepy Joe in the White House as a nice, avuncular, pleasant old individual who can, touch.
So if he can tie his shoelaces,
walk and chew gum. As long as he can walk
if he can't tie his tie, he might get away with it.
He'll get away with it. Yep.
It's astonishing that we're having this discussion, isn't it? That the choices between this raging bull, Donald Trump, and this man who might be allowed to stay in office as long as he can tie his shoelaces, in the most powerful country, the richest country on the earth. How do you think we've got to this?
Only in a country that has the class disparity, the race disparity of the United States, could somebody like Donald Trump be elected as the president. Now, I think Chris Ross, a comedian, said a C-class student can be George Bush and become United States. But it takes a Harvard graduate. No matter what you think about Barack Obama, who I'm not a fan of at all, it's clear he at least had the skills for the position of the job, the oratorial skills and so on. And the fact that Donald Trump, or Joe Biden for that matter, don't, it kind of shows that if you're rich, if you're white, if you've got the right connections, then the world is your oyster, quite literally. And it's quite an indictment of the US system. Now, a recent poll by Pew Research suggested that a lot of the people that are voting for Joe Biden, it was 19% for leadership skills, 59% because he's not Donald Trump. Again, another indictment of the system, that you don't go and vote for who you want to become the president of the United States. You go and vote for who you do not want to see sitting in the Oval Office. And it's scary because these decisions don't just affect, as we've discussed earlier, the people of the United States, but it affect the whole entire world. And whoever sits in the office will definitely have an effect on Venezuela, on Syria, on Iran, on Palestine. So it's an important decision, and it's a real shame that the Democratic establishment did everything they could in their power to prevent somebody that had the skills, that were presenting a policy of real change, of economic reform, and they stopped him not once, but twice from being a Democratic nominee.
Yeah, more fool him, though, for accepting it. I mean, I wouldn't have accepted it.
Yeah.
I would have said, all right, then I'm standing.
Yeah.
And the rest would be history. Let's hear from Michael Seifert from California, who's a German-Mexican-American, originally from New York, documentary filmmaker, best known for the documentaries Rent a Rasta and Bye Bye Havana. Perfect. Michael, welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
Is this election the same as any other, or are we in new territory here? What has changed over the last 4 years?
Well, I think it's the same, except for the fact that the gloves have come off a lot more than 4 years ago. You notice that the language has changed from "I hate you" to "I'm going to kill you." It's no longer a debate or a discussion on the civilized terms. It's like a ultimate fight club kind of situation now, where everything is allowed, low kicks and face punches and scratches. And it's not really pleasant to watch as a, political or election consumer, but that's what we got.
Let me go back to this. I mean, because the big question in many people's minds is, why did the Democrats pick Joe Biden? Is he really a credible presidential candidate?
It's tragic to even have to, answer the question, because who in his right mind would pick a person that is in such a bad, he's not a bad mental shape. He's just a really old person who's had a long life, and he should just be happy and go away. But this is what we got in politics. We always have the worst of two evils. We're not really looking at candidates, with the exception of Trump being sort of a renegade kind of character. But what we deliberate people who we'd rather not have. We'd rather have better choices. And when you saw the Democratic ticket, the primaries, there wasn't much to go on. I mean,
How are minorities reacting to this election, this peculiar dichotomy, Donald Trump or Joe Biden? Who are they backing in this election?
Yeah, the Latin community, I'd say, comprised of a whole, the spectrum of Latin people. It's not Mexicans or Brazilians. It's 25 different Latin communities, so to speak. I think they largely support overwhelmingly the Trump proposal, because those Latin Americans who live in the United States, they're very thankful to be in a system that's organized and supportive for their family's development. Whereas the Latin Americans who are stuck in their home countries and who are not of a privileged middle class or upper class, these guys, they are provided with propaganda to hate Trump by all means. I mean, he's just the orange clown kind of character. But the Latin people in the United States, especially in California, Arizona, Florida, these communities, I think there's very overwhelming support, open support for Trump, because they appreciate the fact that he's trying to keep them in a functioning society whereas they know they come from a very, very dysfunctional society to start with. And ironically, the Mexican president is sort of a dynamic duo in the sense that he wants Mexicans to stay home and Trump wants Mexicans to stay home. So they get along really well in an odd sense, no? Because Mexico wants its people to be prosperous in their own nation, and Trump wants them to stay where they are. I think it's a win-win for both. You know, you can disagree with the fact that it might have racial implications or overtones, but you go to the street in Mexican, California is overwhelmingly, Latin Mexican population. You'd ask these people, the younger guys would say, well, F Trump, but their parents will be very much voting for him.
Stephen, I thought that purple phrase will live. It's gone in 2016 from I hate you to 2020, I'm going to kill you, which is a pretty good summary of where we're at. But the gentleman was touching on some of the many big changes that are coming. He made the point, I think he's not right, actually, numerically yet. He said that California was overwhelmingly Latin, but it will be, and not too distant. The United States will not be a predominantly white European country, probably within the next decade. That will presumably have some political implications. So I'd like your take on this. Is Trump just an aberration that will pass and the Republicans will go back to what they were? Or is Trumpism here to stay? Could his daughter, for example, be a serious presidential candidate? If not for the Republicans, then for a new third party. In other words, can the Republican Party or the Democrats stay together as one entity? When Sanders was cheated, Biden is such a disappointment to the Bernie Sanders base. Trump has so embarrassed the traditional Republicans. Are we not really looking at four parties?
I think the answer to your question is that there is still this enormous suspicion in middle America, the America that gets passed by. We call them the flyover states, where they think that a candidate who actually says, I'm going to drain that swamp and means it, will be very attractive to them. The irony is that in 2016, that person was an avowed multi-billionaire, who, if anybody was in the swamp, was in it up to his neck. However, because he, in a sense, was able to take on the traditional Republican establishment, just remember how he destroyed all those other respectable Republican candidates in the primary, Jeb Bush and Chris Christie, and you could go on. I'm not talking about Rubio and Cruz and all the rest of them. I mean, he destroyed them all. And he did it by being the anti-candidate, just saying these things. I'm going to drain the swamp. I'm going to make America great again. It appealed to that huge section of American opinion outside the two, the eastern seaboard and the western seaboard, which are, if you like, the more educated, the wealthier, and so on. Those are the people who are going to determine the future of American politics. And they could as well move to the left as they could move to the right. I think, Trump himself is the personal aberration. This is a man who is, above all, a fool. A man who says, I think drinking bleach would be a good idea to keep the virus up. A man who says, maybe if we could get some light into our inner throats, it would help to, I could go on. This is a man who says, incidentally, I'm a genius.
Strong and stable genius.
Strong and stable genius, it's laughable. The man himself is appalling in every respect. But what he represents, the I'll drain the swamp, I'll make America great again, that appeal remains the central appeal, I think, to tens of millions of Americans who may well coalesce around a Trump daughter who at least sounds like a rational human being. All she has to do is not be her father, but to address those same issues in that same kind of determined way, and who knows where the 2024 presidential election might go.
Yeah. Jonathan, what about the Democrats? Deep unhappiness, as Ahmed referred to. Bernie Sanders, widely regarded as having been cheated in 2016. I don't think credibly that can be said of 2020. I think he was soundly beaten by the mobilization of Barack Obama for Joe Biden and the huge shift thereafter amongst African Americans towards Biden rather than Sanders. Can the Democrats stay as one party, or does this rise of the Squad, AOC, the younger generations of Bernie's bros and sisters, does that presage a division in the American left, if you like, in the Democratic Party?
Well, I think, yes, there will certainly be divisions, but I think it will stay within the Democratic Party because the American political system is organized in such a way that there's no room for parties splitting up. They will just disappear if they try to do that. This is a two-party system of the most extreme kind, and that will remain the case. And we have to remember, of course, if we go back, say, to the 1960s, there were Southern Democrats who were racist, nasty, extreme right-wing people, and they somehow managed to live in the same party with, Northeast Democrats who were polar opposite. So we shouldn't be too surprised about that. One thing Michael Seifert said, which I found rather interesting, was he was talking about how many of the Latinos will support Trump. And it links into something you were asking about whether Trumpism exists, because of course if we look at Brazil, we see a sort of Trump tribute act in Jair Bolsonaro, and it's very interesting to look at the base of support of Bolsonaro in Brazil, many of whom are evangelical Christians who have very conservative moral views and they don't mind the fact that Bolsonaro and Trump talk nonsense because they believe that they represent them. And final point, on Ivanka Trump. Apparently Trump initially had the idea that she could be his vice presidential candidate until that was sat on very hard by the Republican Party. But it wouldn't be surprising if she has a career in politics, and that's true, of course, in America. Families in politics have a long record, including the Democrat Party with the Kennedys and the Clintons, even if Hillary didn't quite make it.
Yes, it's a strange republic where royal families abound and replicate. I've lost count of the number of Kennedys that are in American politics now, though none of them approach the greatness of the originals. Ahmed, you're a young black man. Do you think that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris represent you and people like you in the United States? After all, Joe Biden actually locked up more his crime bills from the Senate, created a small nation of black prisoners in the United States.
And so did Kamala Harris as the Attorney General.
I was going to say, Kamala Harris was a prosecutorial cop in Northern California. She jailed a lot of black people and laughed about it. For example, possession of marijuana. Which she then also laughed about smoking herself. How credible? And I'm repeating a question I made to you earlier. We've gone from a country of Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, great figures, to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. How does that make you feel?
It's disappointing because there was an interview with Joe Biden. He was on a popular show called The Breakfast Club, and he made a joke and he said, the interviewer asked him, what are you going to offer the black population? And he goes, if you're black and you're thinking about voting for Donald Trump, then you're not black at all. And this is kind of reminiscent of the way the Democratic Party has taken the black vote for granted and just assumed that these places will continue to support them. And sadly, because of the lack of leadership in the African American community, it is the case. There are millions of people that thought Joe Biden represented their interests and not Bernie Sanders, even though if you broke down the policies in terms of healthcare, in terms of tax, justice and welfare, clearly Bernie Sanders represented the interests of African American community more than Joe Biden. But what worries me more is a point that my colleague mentioned, the Trumpism card, is because what we're seeing in the United States, which is not talked about, is identity politics. We talk about identity politics as if it's something that exists solely on the left. But in the United States, because of the demographic change, because of the worry that people that look like me are going to take over and we're going to treat the European citizens the same way that they treated us, that is what's driving Trumpism. And when Joe Biden does win, which I think he will, and he goes on with the neoliberal agenda, continues to leave these communities behind, offer them nothing, then what we're going to see, if not 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, and so on, is a more polished version of Donald Trump. Somebody that doesn't say his blood is the vaccine, somebody that doesn't recommend drinking bleach and showing light and
grabbing women by their private parts.
Exactly.
And all the hideous, ghastly things he's said.
And a more polished version of Donald Trump is actually a more dangerous version of Donald Trump. An idiot like Donald Trump can only possibly last for 4 years, but a more polished version of Donald Trump can set a trend in the United States that can last decades. And what we're seeing at the moment in places like Wisconsin, with the battles on the streets between white armed men and Black Lives Matter activists, it's only a microcosm of what we're going to see in decades to come.
Steve, last word to you. You're the ranking member of the panel, including over me. Paint a picture, will you, for the Arab viewers who will be the main viewers of this show. What would President Biden do differently, do you think?
I think Biden would have been much less decisive in many ways than Donald Trump. If you think of his very, very positive support of Israel at the expense of the Palestinians, if you think of his absolute indifference to the assassination of Soleimani in Iran, despite the potential divisions that might cause, if you look at his willingness to try to get the non-Iranian world aligned, including Israel, against Iran, this is, again, something that I suspect Joe Biden would simply not have had, if you like, that decisiveness, that inner belief in his infallibility, which of course is ironically, one of Trump's greatest sort of afflictions. I think the Arab world will face a much less certain future with Biden, because Biden represents the kind of consensus politics which would, for example, be indifferent to the condition in Syria, would be largely indifferent to the current Israeli-Palestinian standoff, would be more supportive of the UN Iranian nuclear treaty, certainly, and of course...
This will have an impact on Saudi Arabia, won't it?
Indeed.
Because Saudi Arabia, which has, or the ruling family, or at least the Crown Prince, has extremely close relations, not to put too fine a point on it, with Donald Trump and his family, his extended family. They will not like, the Saudis will not like Joe Biden, because he'll be, quote unquote, softer on Iranian issues. Presumably, he'd be rather more upset at, for example, the assassination and dismemberment of the US columnist Khashoggi. He'll not be quite such a pushover for the Saudi Crown Prince.
Well, I mean, I think Joe Biden will be much more in the sort of image of Barack Obama, whose whole stance during his whole 8 years as president was non-interventionism. And he said, incidentally, I'm not going to put young black men, going to kill young black men in action in wars that we can't win. I get that, I understand it. But the reality is that it weakened America enormously. And my own view is that that's going to be the position with Biden. That Biden will simply be much more hesitant, much less decisive than Trump. Yes, in terms of Saudi Arabia, I think Saudi Arabia will regret the arrival of Biden. Not that I think in the end that's going to actually cause any great fundamental division between the US and Saudi Arabia, because, like two drunks around, on the way home, they need to support each other mutually just to get there. I think Biden will be a great disappointment across the whole Middle East, because what you don't see is any definitive solutions.
That was such a good line, I'm tempted to make it the final one, but I do have one more question. China, in an increasingly unhinged way, Donald Trump is threatening China. Just this week, he said in the darkest possible way that he's going to make China pay for the coronavirus and so on. Russia, which the Democrats have accused of picking Donald Trump in the first place. What does President Biden do vis-a-vis these two big powers, Russia and China?
I think that, ironically, Trump's madness has had quite a calming influence on those countries who might be regarded as, if you like, the enemies of the free world, which, of course, in many people's eyes would be China, would be Russia, would be North Korea, and so on. Because with Obama, they said, don't worry, he'll never do anything. Whereas with Trump, they think, you know, this guy's mad enough. He might just press that big red button because he's got a bigger red button than you've got. You know, that sort of, I'm sorry about my dog. I hope it doesn't bite you, you know, as you hold it back, come back, Fido, you know. This was the Trump impact. I mean, yeah, take out a senior Iranian official. No worry. And what did the Iranians do? Nothing, effectively nothing. I think the irony is that the Chinese will be delighted, the Russians will be delighted, the North Koreans will be delighted with the advent of President Biden, because he's going to be very much in the same mold as his democratic predecessor. And that's not good, I think, for world stability.
Well, we could argue about that, but we're out of time. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra. My thanks to my distinguished panel, and thanks to you for watching.